I let them think I was broke. I wore the same coat for 3 winters, counted every dollar at the grocery store, smiled when my daughter-in-law sighed and said, "Some people just can't manage money." My son didn't look at me. Not once. Then my phone rang. "Mrs. Carter," the lawyer said, "your account has been active for years." I froze. What account? Silence. Then numbers. Monthly transfers. Property income. Thousands of dollars in my name. I checked my mailbox that night. Nothing. Like always. At dinner, she laughed again. Must be hard living like that. I watched her this time. Really watched her. The way she avoided my eyes. The way my son stayed quiet. And suddenly, everything made sense. The paperwork she insisted on handling. The bank visits I wasn't invited to. The signatures I never remembered signing. I folded my napkin. Slowly. Smiled. "You're right," I said. "It is hard." They thought I had nothing. They thought I was weak. They thought I'd never notice. But I did. And what I found was just the beginning. The next morning felt quieter than usual, but not in a peaceful way, more like the kind of silence that comes when something has already shifted and has not yet been acknowledged. I woke before sunrise, the house still dark, and lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, replaying the lawyer's words in my mind, not with panic, but with precision, like I was turning them over to see where they fit. $2,000 a month. For 3 years. That was $72,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to make the difference between choosing medication or groceries, between fixing the heater last winter or layering blankets and pretending it was not that cold. I sat up slowly and reached for my robe, the same one I had owned for nearly a decade, soft at the edges, worn thin at the sleeves. Nothing about my life reflected the numbers I had heard the day before. That was what stayed with me the most. Not the money itself, but the absence of it. I walked into the kitchen and opened the drawer where I kept my bills. Everything was there, neatly stacked, carefully managed. Utility statements, pharmacy receipts, grocery totals, written in my own handwriting. I had always kept track, always believed that if I stayed organized, I could stay in control. But now I could see the gaps. The missing pieces I had dismissed as delays or simple errors. The statements that never arrived. The bank notices I was told had been handled online. I made coffee again, the same routine, the same mug, but nothing felt routine anymore. I took a sip and set it down without tasting it. Instead, I reached for my purse and pulled out the small folder where I kept important documents. Insurance cards, identification, a few old bank statements from years ago, before everything had been simplified for me. I flipped through them slowly. Dates, account numbers, names, my name. Always my name. I thought about the times my daughter-in-law had insisted on helping. "It is easier if I manage it," she had said, smiling as she took the papers from my hands. I remembered how grateful I had felt then, how relieved. It seemed reasonable, practical. She was younger, more familiar with online systems. At least that is what I told myself. I closed the folder and sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet again. But this time, it was not empty. It was full of things I had not allowed myself to notice. The way she always checked the mail first. The way she would casually mention payments I did not remember making. The way my son would defer to her without question, as if the decisions had already been made before I was even aware there was a choice. I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it to retrieve the morning mail. Just a few envelopes. Advertisements. A utility bill. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained anything. And yet, I held them in my hands a little longer than necessary, as if expecting something else to appear, something that had been missing all this time. I closed the door and set the mail on the table. Then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I did not dismiss the feeling. I did not explain it away. I let it settle. I let the questions remain unanswered. Because now, for the first time, I understood that what I had believed was careful management might have been something else entirely. Something quieter. Something deliberate. I picked up my phone and looked at it, not hesitating this time. Not doubting. If the money existed, there would be records. If there were records, there would be a path. And if there was a path, it would lead somewhere. I was no longer trying to understand whether something was wrong. I already knew that. What mattered now was how long it had been happening, and who had been standing in the middle of it all, making sure I never saw it. I did not call the lawyer back right away. Instead, I chose something simpler. Something quieter. I waited. That evening, I went to their house again, just like I always did, at the same time, wearing the same coat, carrying the same small container of food I knew they would barely touch. Nothing about me suggested anything had changed, and that was exactly how I wanted it. My daughter-in-law opened the door with her usual smile, polite but thin, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "You did not have to bring anything," she said, though her tone suggested she expected me to. I stepped inside and handed it to her anyway. "It is nothing," I replied, my voice steady, my expression calm. My son was in the living room, scrolling through his phone, glancing up just long enough to acknowledge me before returning to whatever had his attention. We sat down to dinner a few minutes later. The table was set neatly, everything in its place, the kind of order that looks comforting until you realize how little space there is for anything unexpected. I watched them more closely this time. Not openly. Not in a way that would draw attention. Just enough to notice what I had missed before. The way she reached for his hand under the table when certain topics came up. The way he deferred to her without thinking, letting her speak first, letting her decide the tone of every conversation. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. "Did you get your utility bill this month?" she asked casually, cutting into her food without looking at me. "That is happening everywhere," she replied. "We have been keeping an eye on your expenses, making sure nothing gets out of control." The words settled between us, heavier than it should have been. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully. "That is thoughtful," I said, and I meant it in a way she would not understand. My son finally looked at me then, but only briefly. There was something in his expression. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like discomfort. Like he knew something was being said without being said, and he preferred not to examine it too closely. The conversation moved on. Light topics. Weather. Work. Small things that filled the space without meaning anything. But I stayed with that one moment. With that one word. After dinner, she stood up and began clearing the table before I could offer to help. "You should rest," she said lightly. "No need to worry about these things." I watched her gather the plates, efficient, controlled, every movement deliberate. She had always been like that. Organized, capable, trustworthy. At least that was how I had described her to others. I stood slowly and walked to the kitchen anyway, setting my hands on the counter as if I needed the support, though I did not. "I appreciate everything you do," I said quietly. She glanced at me, just for a second, then smiled again. "Of course," she replied. "We are family." I nodded. Family. The word sounded different now. Not warm. Not comforting. Just precise. I picked up my purse and moved toward the door. My son followed, walking me out like he always did. "Drive safe," he said, his voice soft, almost automatic. I looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Long enough for him to notice. Long enough for him to shift slightly, as if something about the silence made him uneasy. "I always do," I replied. Then I stepped outside, the cool evening air settling around me. I did not rush to my car. I did not look back. I simply stood there for a moment, letting everything I had seen, everything I had heard, settle into place. They believed they were managing things for me. They believed I needed them. They believed I did not know. And the most dangerous part was not what they had done. It was how comfortable they had become doing it. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there in the quiet. This time, I did not feel confused. I did not feel uncertain. I felt focused. Because now, it was no longer about whether something was wrong. It was about proving it. And I knew exactly where I needed to look next. The next day, I did not change my routine. That was important. Change would raise questions, and I was not ready to answer any. I woke at the same time, made the same coffee, and sat at the same table. But this time I brought the old folder back out and placed it beside me, not to search blindly, but to compare. I needed facts, not feelings. I started with what I knew. The lawyer had said there were monthly transfers. Regular. Consistent. That meant records existed somewhere beyond what I had been allowed to see. I opened the folder and took out the oldest bank statement I had kept, one from years ago, before everything had been simplified for me. The account number was there. Clear. Untouched. I read it twice, then again, committing it to memory. Then I reached for my phone and called the bank directly, not the branch I had been taken to before, but the main customer service line, the one that did not recognize familiar voices or friendly faces. I kept my tone calm, measured. I asked for general information first, nothing specific, just enough to understand how accounts could be accessed, how permissions could be granted, how changes could be made without the primary holder being present. The answers were polite, careful, and more revealing than they intended to be. Authorized users, online access, digital signatures. Each explanation felt like a piece of a structure I had never seen, but had been living inside for years. When I ended the call, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt clearer. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. Not the one near my house, but a branch 20 miles away, one I had never visited before. I wanted distance. I wanted neutrality. Inside, everything looked the same as any other branch. Clean counters, quiet conversations, the low hum of routine transactions. I approached the desk and waited until someone greeted me. A young man, professional, attentive. He asked how he could help. I gave him my name, my identification, and then, very simply, I asked him to show me every account associated with it. He hesitated for just a second, not enough to be noticeable to anyone else, but enough for me. Then he turned to his screen and began typing. I watched his expression change as the information appeared. Not dramatically, just a slight shift, a tightening around the eyes. There are multiple accounts, he said carefully. Would you like to review them one by one? I nodded. Yes, I replied. All of them. He turned the screen slightly, so I could see. And there it was. Not one account. Several. Active. Maintained. With balances that did not match the life I had been living. My hands remained still on the counter. I did not reach out. I did not react. I simply looked. Dates. Transactions. Deposits. Monthly. Just as the lawyer had said. Consistent. Predictable. And then I saw it. Transfers out. Regular. Routed to another account. Not mine. I did not need to ask whose it was. I already knew. Can you print this? I asked quietly. He nodded and turned to the printer without question. The sound of the pages sliding out was louder than it should have been. I gathered them carefully, aligning the edges, keeping everything neat, controlled. Is there anything else I can assist you with? He asked. I looked at him for a moment, then shook my head. No, I said. You have already helped enough. I left the bank and sat in my car, the documents resting in my lap. I did not read them again. I did not need to. The pattern was clear. The path was visible. The question of whether something had been taken was no longer a question. It was a fact. But what mattered now was not the discovery. It was what came next. I started the engine and drove home slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the time. Time to think. Time to decide. Because now I was no longer guessing. I was no longer observing. I was preparing. And the difference between those things changes everything. I did not confront them that night. That would have been too easy, too direct. And I had already learned that the truth does not always reveal itself when you ask for it. Sometimes, it shows itself when you give people space to continue believing they are unseen. I placed the documents in a drawer when I got home. Not hidden, not locked away, just out of sight, as if they were no more important than the bills I had been carefully managing for years. Then I made dinner. Something simple. Soup and bread. I moved through the motions the same way I always had. Steady, quiet, controlled. But my mind was no longer on what I was doing. It was on what I had seen. The pattern of the transfers. The consistency of the withdrawals. The precision of it all. This was not careless. It was structured. Intentional. And that meant it had been planned. The next morning, I called the lawyer back. Not to ask questions. Not yet. Just to listen. He confirmed everything again. This time with more detail, more clarity. The accounts had been active under my name, but access had been granted to another user years ago. Authorized. Documented. Legal, at least on the surface. Do you recognize the name on the secondary access? He asked. I closed my eyes for a brief moment before answering. Yes, I said. I do. There was no surprise in my voice. No hesitation. Because by then, I already understood. He explained the options. Reviews. Audits. Legal steps that could be taken. But I did not commit to anything. Not yet. I will get back to you, I said calmly. When I hung up, I sat at the table and folded my hands in front of me. Not in prayer. Not in worry. Just stillness. Because now, it was no longer about discovering the truth. It was about deciding how to use it. That evening, I went back to their house again. Same time. Same routine. I noticed how easily everything continued. How naturally they played their roles. She greeted me with the same measured warmth. He asked the same simple questions. Dinner was served. Conversation moved along its usual path. And yet, Every word sounded different to me now. Every gesture felt deliberate. We stopped by the bank earlier this week. She mentioned casually at one point, not looking directly at me. Just taking care of a few things. I nodded slightly. That is good, I replied. It is important to stay on top of those details. She smiled, just briefly, then looked back at her plate. My son shifted in his chair, but said nothing. I let the silence sit for a moment longer than usual before reaching for my glass. I might stop by myself sometime soon, I added, my tone light, almost offhand. That was when it happened. A pause. Small, almost invisible, but real. She looked up then, her expression controlled, but not quite as relaxed as before. There is no need, she said quickly. Everything is already handled. I met her eyes. Not challengingly, not accusingly, just long enough. I am sure it is, I said, but I would like to see it for myself. The words were simple, calm, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she nodded once and returned to her meal, her movements just slightly more precise than before. My son glanced between us, uncertain, but still silent. Full authorization history on my accounts. Every document that showed when access had been granted, by whom, and under what conditions. The representative on the phone was careful, professional, but I could hear the shift in her tone when she realized I was not asking out of curiosity. I was asking with purpose. Those records may take a few days to compile, she said. That is fine, I replied. I will wait. And I meant it. Waiting no longer felt like weakness. It felt like control. While I waited, I changed nothing on the surface. I went about my days the same way, spoke the same way, moved through each moment as if I had not already seen behind the curtain. But inside, everything was sharper, more defined. I began to notice details I had overlooked for years. The way my daughter-in-law kept her phone close whenever financial topics came up. The way she would subtly redirect conversations if I asked even the simplest question about expenses or accounts. The way my son would follow her lead without realizing he was doing it, as if it had become second nature. That evening, I was invited over again, though invited was not quite the right word. It was expected, routine, predictable. I arrived at the usual time, stepped inside, and let the familiar scene unfold around me. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her movements efficient and controlled. That involved, she explained, her tone smooth, confident, as if she had already rehearsed the answer. Transfers, consolidation, easier access, less confusion. It was all very reasonable, very practical. If you did not know what you were looking at, I nodded slowly, as if I were following along, as if I trusted every word. And who would manage that? I asked, my voice calm, almost casual. She smiled then, just slightly. We would take care of it, she said. We. There it was again. I turned my attention to my son, watching him instead of her this time. He shifted in his seat, clearing his throat lightly, but he did not interrupt. He did not question. He did not offer an alternative. He simply let it stand. That told me more than anything she had said. I picked up my fork and continued eating, as if the conversation had not just confirmed everything I needed to know. I appreciate the offer, I said after a moment, but I think I would like to review everything myself first. The words were simple, measured, but they landed differently. I saw it in her expression. Just a flicker. Just enough. She recovered quickly, of course. She always did. Of course, she replied. Whatever makes you comfortable. Comfortable. I almost smiled at that. After dinner, I did not linger. I thanked them, gathered my things, and headed for the door. My son walked me out again, just as he always did, but this time he hesitated before speaking. Mom, he said quietly, if you need help with anything. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I wondered how much he understood, how much he chose not to see. I will let you know, I replied. And that was enough. When I got home, I sat in the same chair, at the same table, and waited. Not for answers. Not anymore. I already had those. I was waiting for the documents. For the confirmation that would turn what I knew into something undeniable. Because once it was undeniable, everything would change. Not just for me. For them. And they still had no idea how close that moment was. The envelope arrived 3 days later. It was plain, unremarkable, the kind of mail most people would set aside without a second thought. But I knew what it was before I even opened the door. I could feel it in the stillness of the morning, in the way everything seemed to pause just slightly, as if waiting for me to notice. I picked it up, turned it over once in my hands, then carried it inside and placed it on the table. I did not open it immediately. That was important. Rushing would have made it feel like a reaction, and I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. I made coffee first, sat down, let the quiet settle around me. Then, finally, I opened it. The documents were exactly what I had asked for. Detailed, precise, dates, signatures, authorization forms. Everything laid out in a way that did not require interpretation. It did not tell a story. It showed a pattern. Access had been granted years ago, just as the lawyer had said. A signature that looked like mine, but I knew better now. A time when I had trusted too easily. When I had believed help and control were the same thing. I turned the page slowly. Transfers. Monthly. Consistent. Routed from my accounts into another. The name appeared clearly this time. Not hidden. Not abbreviated. My daughter-in-law. There was no mistake. No confusion. Just confirmation. I did not feel anger. Not in the way most people would expect. It was something quieter than that. Something steadier. Because anger demands an immediate response. And I had already learned that immediate responses rarely change anything. I placed the papers back in the envelope and folded my hands over it, resting them lightly as if I were keeping it in place. Then I looked around my kitchen. The same table. The same chair. The same life I had been living while all of this had been happening in the background, just out of sight. Not because it was hidden well, but because I had not been looking for it. That was the part that stayed with me. Not just what they had done, but how easily it had been allowed to continue. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I reviewed every document I had. Every piece of paper, every note, every record I had kept. Not searching randomly, but aligning them. Matching dates. Comparing details. And with each connection, the picture became clearer. There were moments I remembered now with a different understanding. Times when she had insisted on signing something for me because I was too busy. Times when my son had reassured me that everything was handled, that I did not need to worry. I had believed them. That was the simplest truth of all. I had believed them because it was easier than questioning them. By the time the sun began to set, I had everything I needed laid out in front of me. Not just proof. Structure. Sequence. Intent. This had not been a mistake. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a system, carefully built, quietly maintained, and now completely visible. That evening, I did not go to their house. I did not call. I did not explain. I let the routine break without warning. Because sometimes, the first real signal that something has changed is absence. I sat in my chair as the light faded, the room growing dim around me. And for the first time since the call, I allowed myself to consider what came next. Not in terms of confrontation. Not yet. But in terms of control. Because now, I understood something I had not before. They had built their confidence on the belief that I would never see this. That I would never question it. That I would never act. And that belief had made them careless. Not in what they did, but in how secure they felt doing it. I picked up the envelope again, holding it just long enough to feel its weight, then set it down with care. Everything was in place now. The truth was no longer hidden. It was documented. And once something is documented, it does not disappear. It waits. And I had decided that I would not rush what came next. Because the moment I chose to move forward, it would not be a reaction. It would be a decision. I let one full day pass before I did anything visible again. No calls. No visits. No explanations. Silence, when used correctly, has a way of creating its own pressure. By the second day, my phone rang. I looked at the screen before answering. My son. I let it ring once more before picking up. Mom. His voice carried something new. Not concern. Not exactly. Something closer to uncertainty. We did not see you last night. I sat at the table, the envelope resting beside me, unopened this time, because I no longer needed to look inside. I was tired, I said simply. A pause followed. Short. Careful. Are you feeling all right? He asked. I could almost hear her in the background. Not speaking. Just listening. I am fine, I replied. And I was. That was the difference now. He hesitated again, then cleared his throat lightly. We were just making sure everything is okay with your accounts. Bills. Things like that. There it was. Not a question. A check. A subtle one, but clear enough. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him aware of it. Everything is under control, I said. Calm. Even. Final. He did not press further. He never did. All right, he said quietly. Let us know if you need anything. I ended the call and set the phone down without another word. That afternoon, I called the lawyer again. This time, I did not ask for information. I gave instructions. We scheduled a formal review. Not immediately. Not urgently. Precisely. Enough time to prepare everything properly. To ensure that when it happened, it would not be dismissed or explained away. He understood without needing much detail. Professionals often do. That evening, I went back to their house. Not because I needed to, because I chose to. The door opened, and she stood there, her expression composed, but tighter than before. We were worried, she said, stepping aside to let me in. I nodded slightly. There was no need. My son hovered just behind her, his posture uncertain, as if he was trying to read something that was no longer easy to understand. Dinner was quieter than usual. Not awkward. Not tense in an obvious way. Just careful. Words were chosen more slowly. Glances were shorter. The rhythm had shifted, even if they could not yet define how. At one point, she set her fork down and looked at me directly. We can go over your accounts together this week, she said, her tone measured, almost reassuring. Just to make sure everything is clear. I met her gaze, steady, unhurried. That will not be necessary, I replied. No explanation. No added detail. Just the statement. She held my gaze for a moment longer than she intended to, then nodded once and looked away.